There are moments in life that nobody plans for, moments that arrive without warning, without a script, without any instruction on how to behave. And then there are people, rare, extraordinary people, who seem to have been quietly preparing for those moments their entire lives without even knowing it. This is a story about one of those people. She was 9 years old. His name was James Whitfield. 17 years in the King's Guard, yet he had stood at the gates of Buckingham Palace through 3 winters, so bitter his fingers went numb inside his gloves. He had stood at attention during state funerals when the grief in the crowd pressed against him like a physical weight. He had watched the world change around those iron gates. The protests, the celebrations, the tourists with their cameras, the flowers piled high after tragedies he couldn't speak about publicly. He had seen a great many things in 17 years. But nothing, not one single moment across all those years, had prepared him for the afternoon of October the 14th. It started like every other public engagement. Clean sky, crisp air, the kind of autumn afternoon that makes London look like a painting rather than a city. The royal family was attending a remembrance ceremony at a veterans' memorial garden in Windsor. It was a dignified event, attended by former soldiers, aging men and women who walked slowly now, whose medals caught the afternoon light as they moved. James was positioned along the outer perimeter. His role that day was straightforward: maintain the boundary, keep the public route clear, watch for anything unusual. Standard assignment. He had done it dozens of times. The ceremony began. There were speeches. There were flowers laid carefully at the base of the memorial. There was a choir, children actually, from a local school, who sang with the kind of earnest imperfection that makes people's eyes go wet without them entirely understanding why. James kept his eyes moving, methodical, professional. The crowd to his left, the entrance to his right, the path between them. And then something pulled his attention toward the royal party. Not a sound, not a movement, just a shift in the atmosphere, the way a room changes when something is about to happen, and every person in it feels it before they see it. He looked. An elderly veteran had stepped forward from the row of men and women standing near the memorial. He was perhaps in his late 80s. His medals were numerous, more than most James had ever seen on a single chest, and he walked with a cane that tapped against the stone path in a slow, unsteady rhythm. He was moving toward the memorial to lay his own wreath, as several veterans had already done. It was his turn, his moment. On halfway there, something went wrong. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about it. There was no collapse, no cry, no sudden scene. The old man simply stopped. His cane wobbled. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The wreath in his free hand tilted, and his feet, those slow, careful feet, shuffled in a way that was not walking anymore. He was losing his balance, quietly, with great dignity, but losing it. The people nearest him noticed. A collective inhale. And that frozen second when everyone sees a problem and everyone's body takes just a half beat too long to respond. Everyone's body except one. Princess Charlotte moved before any adult in that space moved. She didn't run. She didn't make a noise. She simply stepped, quick, clean, deliberate, out from her position beside her mother and crossed the short distance between herself and the veteran with the certainty of someone twice her age and 3 times her experience. Her hand went to his arm first, then her shoulder pressed gently against his side, small as she was, 9 years old and barely reaching his chest, offering what her body could offer. Steadiness, presence, someone there. James watched, and something happened in his chest that he would later struggle to describe adequately. The old man registered her. His eyes dropped to find her face. She looked up at him, not with alarm, not with the wide, uncertain eyes of a child in an unfamiliar situation, but with a calm so complete it seemed to settle the air around them both. She said something. James was too far to hear the words. But he saw the veteran's shoulders change. The rigidity of the embarrassment, that particular stiffness of an old man afraid he had become a spectacle, slowly released. He straightened, not much, but enough. His grip on the cane steadied. Charlotte stayed beside him. She did not step back. She did not look around to see who was watching. She did not search for her mother or for a member of staff who might be better equipped to handle the situation. She stayed exactly where she was, her hand on that old man's arm, and she walked the remaining distance to the memorial with him, step by step, slow, patient steps. When he laid his wreath, she stood slightly behind his shoulder, close enough to catch him if something shifted, far enough to give him the dignity of the moment as his own. The crowd had gone entirely silent. James realized his jaw was tight, not from tension, from something else entirely. That specific kind of tightness that arrives just before emotion does, when a person is holding something back without quite deciding to. The veteran turned to Charlotte when it was done. His hand found hers. He bent his head, this old man with his decades of service and his chest full of medals, and he said something to her that made her smile. Not a performance smile, the real kind. The kind that starts in the eyes before the mouth catches up. She said something back. He laughed. A short, surprised sound, the kind that escapes a person before they can decide whether to let it. And then Charlotte stepped back to her position beside her mother with the same quiet efficiency with which she had left it. No fuss, no acknowledgement of what had happened. She straightened her coat, folded her hands, and returned her attention to the ceremony as if she had only stepped away to tie a shoelace. The ceremony continued, but the air was different now. James turned his gaze back to the perimeter. His job, his post, the gate and the crowd and the entrance path. He stood there for a long moment doing nothing but breathing. 17 years, he thought, and he had never once seen anything quite like that. The girl was 9 years old. She had not been told to do what she did. No protocol covered it. No training manual contained instructions for a 9-year-old princess deciding, in the space of a single breath, that a stranger needed someone beside them and that she was the right person to be that someone. She had simply looked, seen, gone. Now the afternoon continued. The memorial garden held its quiet dignity. The choir sang one more song. The flowers stayed bright against the stone, and James Whitfield stood at his post and thought about courage, what it actually looks like when it arrives. Not in armor, not with a speech, not announced. Just a small hand on an old man's arm. Just someone who decided not to wait. James did not tell anyone what he had seen that afternoon. Not immediately. Not because it felt secret, but because it felt fragile. The way certain things do when they are still settling inside a person, when putting them into words too soon might break something that isn't finished forming yet. He drove home. He ate dinner. He sat in his kitchen for a longer time than usual, not reading, not watching anything, just sitting with a cup of tea that went cold before he remembered it was there. His daughter called that evening. She was 23 now, studying in Edinburgh. They spoke every Sunday without fail, and occasionally, mid-week, when one of them had something to say that couldn't wait. She called midweek that night, which meant she had something. "You sound strange," she said, approximately 4 minutes into the call. "I'm fine," he said. "Dad." He told her. Not all of it. He never discussed specific assignments in detail, but enough. A young girl. An old soldier, a small act that nobody organized or planned, a hand on an arm, on the way the veteran's shoulders changed. His daughter was quiet for a moment on the other end. Then she said, "That's the thing, isn't it? The people who actually help are never thinking about whether they should." He thought about that for a long time after they hung up. The people who actually help are never thinking about whether they should. He had spent 17 years watching public life from the outside edge of it. He had watched powerful people perform kindness, the arranged photo, on the choreographed handshake, the pre-approved statement of sympathy, and he respected the function of it, understood that public ritual serves real purposes. But he knew the difference. He had always known the difference even before he could articulate what that difference was. What he had seen in that memorial garden was not a performance. It was a reflex. And a reflex tells you something about a person that a performance never can. 3 weeks later, there was another engagement. A different venue, different occasion, a children's hospital in central London. James was not part of the close protection detail for that visit, but a colleague of his was. A man named David Osei, who had been in the Guard for 11 years and who was, by general consensus, the least excitable person in any room he entered. David found James in the staff corridor 2 days after the hospital visit. He stopped beside him without preamble, and in the way that people do when they have been thinking about something long enough that the social lead-up to saying it seems unnecessary. "You know," David said, "I've been doing this a long time." James waited. "The hospital yesterday." David paused. There was a boy, maybe 7, the ward they visited. It was a long-term care ward, the kind where the children have been there for months, the kind where the parents have that look. He didn't explain what look. He didn't need to. James had seen it on the faces of parents outside hospitals, outside courtrooms, outside churches. The look of people who have been standing inside something terrible for so long that the terrible has become ordinary, which is its own specific kind of grief. "She spent twice the scheduled time in that ward," David said. "Not performing, just sitting, asking questions, listening to answers. The boy with the trains, he had a whole system laid out on his bed, this whole complicated railway network he'd built, and she sat on the edge of that bed and she asked him about every single train, the names, where they were going, why that one was his favorite." He stopped. "She wasn't doing a royal visit. She was just there." James nodded slowly. "Her mother was watching her," David continued, "from across the room, and the expression on her face—" He stopped again, looked at the middle distance for a moment. It wasn't pride exactly, or it was something older than pride, like she was watching something she recognized. The 2 men stood in the corridor for a moment in the particular silence that exists between people who have spent years in proximity to history and have learned not to be careless with what they observe. "I've been thinking about it since," David said. "What it means when someone that young already knows how to be present with someone who is suffering. How that happens. That's where it comes from." James thought about his daughter's words. The people who actually help are never thinking about whether they should. "I don't think it's something you learn," James said. "I think it's something you either have or you don't. But you can be given permission to use it or not." David looked at him. "You think she was given permission?" "I think she was shown," James said. There's a difference. There is a particular burden that comes with a public life begun in childhood that most people never fully consider. The cameras at the school gate on the first day, the global commentary on a child's haircut, a child's expression, a child's choice of shoes, the knowledge, absorbed before the child is old enough to have chosen to absorb it, that the world is watching, and the world has opinions, and the world is not always kind. The psychological weight of that, and for an ordinary child, would be considerable. For a child growing up inside one of the most scrutinized families on the planet, it is something else entirely. James thought about this sometimes on the long, static hours of a gate posting, when his mind had nothing else to occupy it. He thought about what it would mean to grow up knowing that your grief would be photographed, your awkward years documented, and your mistakes preserved and distributed and discussed by strangers on the other side of the world who would never know you as a person, only as an image, a symbol that people needed to mean something, whatever that something was. He thought about what it would take to remain inside all of that genuinely kind, not performed kindness, not strategic warmth, not the careful deployment of empathy as a public relations tool, the actual thing. Because what he had seen in that garden, and what David had described in that hospital ward, was not a child executing a public image strategy. Charlotte was 9. She was not managing perception. She was doing the thing that felt right because it was right, with the kind of moral clarity that adults spend years trying to recover after the world has taught them all the reasons not to bother. A veteran needed someone beside him. A boy wanted someone to care about his trains. And she had simply looked and gone, both times, without calculation. James had met people in his life, grown adults, experienced people, good people, who could not do that, who saw the need and felt the pull and then let something intervene. The question of whether it was their place. The uncertainty about whether their presence would make it better or worse. The awareness of other people watching, and the self-consciousness that awareness creates. Charlotte, at 9 years old, he did not appear to have that particular interference running. He wondered if she knew that about herself. Probably not in any conscious named way. Self-awareness about your own grace is usually the last thing that arrives, if it arrives at all. She was just a girl, standing in a memorial garden, deciding to be where she was needed. And somewhere on the outer perimeter, and a man in a uniform was learning something about courage that 17 years of service had not yet managed to teach him. That it isn't about the size of the moment. It isn't about the audience. It isn't about being unafraid. It is about being so focused on the person in front of you that none of those other things have room to take up space. November came in hard that year, cold and gray and unrelenting, the kind of month that makes London feel like a city holding its breath. James had a difficult posting at the start of it. A protest had gathered outside the gates, peaceful but loud, as protests often are when people have been patient for a very long time and patience has finally run out. His job was simple in theory. Stand, hold the line, be a professional, do not engage, do not escalate, do not react. In practice, standing between an angry crowd and an iron gate for 6 hours while people shout words at you that are not really directed at you personally, that takes something out of a person. Not physically. Something quieter than that. He drove home that evening feeling scraped thin. He made dinner. He tried to read and found he couldn't focus. He turned the television on and then turned it off again because the noise felt wrong in the flat. He thought about the veteran in the garden, and about the boy with the trains, about the particular quality of Charlotte's stillness, the way she moved toward difficulty rather than away from it, not with bravado, not with any kind of performance, but with the simple directness of someone who has never learned to treat other people's pain as something to be navigated around. He realized he was drawing on it, on the memory of a 9-year-old girl doing something brave, using it as a resource in his own harder moment. That was strange, he thought. That was also, he suspected, the point. In the second week of November, James was asked to cover a shift at a different posting, inside the grounds, rather than at the perimeter, a position that placed him considerably closer to the family's daily movements than his usual assignment. It was during this shift that he encountered Charlotte for the first time not as a distant figure in a public ceremony, but as a child going about an ordinary afternoon, and she was walking with her governess across the east lawn. She had a bag over one shoulder that appeared to be entirely too heavy for her frame, and she was reading something, a folded piece of paper, some document or assignment, as she walked, which meant she was not entirely watching where she was going, which meant she nearly walked directly into a garden bollard before her governess caught her elbow. She stopped, looked at the bollard, looked at her governess. "And I knew it was there," she said with great dignity. Her governess said nothing, but the corner of her mouth did something. James kept his eyes straight ahead, the way you do. Charlotte continued across the lawn, the paper now folded and stowed, both eyes committed to the path. She passed within perhaps 15 feet of where James was standing, and as she passed, she glanced toward him. Not a long look. Just the automatic awareness of another person in a space. The brief acknowledgement that most people make without thinking, a fraction of eye contact that says, "I see you are here." Then she continued on. It was nothing. A small, ordinary moment. And yet, there are people in the world, most people actually, who walk past the person standing at the gate without seeing them at all. Not because they are unkind, because the guard is furniture. The uniform creates a category, and in the category does not require acknowledgement. James was familiar with this. He had been furniture for 17 years. It is not an insult, it is simply what the job is. But occasionally, not often, maybe a handful of times across a career, someone would look, really look, the way Charlotte had looked at that veteran in the garden, with actual attention, actual recognition. The look that says, "You are a person." She had given him a fraction of that, without breaking stride. He filed it away in the same place he had filed the garden and the hospital ward. The thing about watching someone over time, even briefly, even from a distance, is that a picture builds. Not from any single observation, but from the accumulation of small things. The way a person holds tension in their shoulders, whether they laugh with their whole face or just their mouth. What they do in the pause between one thing and the next. When no one is watching and the performance pressure drops. James had developed this observation as a professional skill. It is, in essence, what a security professional does. Read people, not to judge them, but to understand what they are likely to do next. What the accumulated picture told him about Charlotte was this. She was not performing composure. She had it. These are different things. Performed composure is the locked jaw, the rigid posture. See the deliberate blankness of expression that says I am holding myself together through force of will. James had seen this on the faces of royals and politicians and senior officers and grieving parents, and he recognized it because he had worn it himself. It is a necessary skill. It is not the same as actual internal steadiness. Charlotte's composure was not rigid. It was loose. That was what made it different. She laughed when things were funny. She frowned when things were complicated. Her face moved the way a child's face moves when it has not yet learned the full arsenal of social masks. But underneath the expressiveness, there was something stable, a ground floor that didn't shift. James thought about the circumstances that produce that quality in a young person. It is not the absence of difficulty. He was certain of that. Children who have experienced no difficulty tend toward a different kind of steadiness, the settled confidence of those who have never been tested. And that steadiness is real, but it is also untested. It does not yet know what it is made of. The steadiness he observed in Charlotte had a different texture. It had been somewhere. It had seen things. Not dramatic, traumatic things, but the ordinary specific grief of growing up inside loss, inside public scrutiny, inside the awareness that the world you were born into carries weight that other children never have to carry. And from somewhere inside all of that, she had drawn not bitterness, not performance, not the careful management of a person trying to control how they are perceived. She had drawn kindness, simple, unremarkable, functional kindness. The kind that moves toward a wobbling old man before the adults have organized themselves. The kind that sits on the edge of a hospital bed and asks about trains. The kind that, passing a man standing at a post doing his job, gives him a fraction of a glance that says, "I see that you are here." Or James received a commendation that month, a routine thing, in the way that commendations become routine after enough years. The formal acknowledgement of sustained professionalism that he accepted with genuine but unremarkable gratitude. His supervisor shook his hand. There was paperwork. There was a brief moment of standing in a hallway being thanked by a person whose title required him to keep his expression neutral. And he did not tell his supervisor that the thing he was most proud of from the preceding months had nothing to do with anything in his official record, that it was a memory, a memorial garden in October, the sound of a cane on stone, a small figure stepping forward when everyone else was still processing. He carried it with him back to his post, to the gate and the crowd and the long, still hours of watching. He had spent 17 years learning what strength looked like, and he was revising the definition. December arrived and brought with it a particular kind of public occasion that James had come to regard with a complicated mix of professional focus and personal feeling: the Christmas charity event at Windsor, an annual gathering that drew a large and varied crowd: families, veterans, community workers, people who had been nominated by local organizations for various acts of quiet service throughout the year. These events were, in James's professional opinion, the most genuinely moving of all the public engagements, not because of the ceremony or the history or the setting, though all of those things were present, but because of who attended. Ordinary people. People who had done extraordinary things in the specific low-key way that most extraordinary things get done. Not for recognition, not for record, but because the need was there, and they were there. James was on inner perimeter duty, closer than usual. It is close enough to observe the room with detail. The family moved through the gathering in the organized way that these events are structured: small groups, brief conversations, the practiced ease of people who have done this many times while remaining genuinely present in it. He watched the Princess of Wales work the room with a quality he had always admired in her: the ability to make each individual conversation feel, at least for its duration, like the only conversation, the full attention. But the questions that showed she had read the briefing notes, but also that she was listening past them. And behind her, orbiting in the way that children orbit a parent in public, close enough to feel safe, independent enough to exist in their own engagement, Charlotte. She had been briefed on the guests. James knew this because there had been a prep session that morning, a standard element for engagements where the personal history of attendees mattered for the conversation. And she knew who she was going to meet in the broad strokes, names and reasons. What the briefing could not prepare her for was the specifics. The woman in the blue coat, for instance. She was perhaps 60. Her name was Margaret. She had been nominated by her local community for 12 years of running a grief support group out of her own home, a group that had, over those years, helped hundreds of people through losses that the formal systems of support had not adequately addressed. And she had done it after losing her own husband. She had turned her own wreckage into a resource and had kept turning up to do that work every week for over a decade. Charlotte was directed toward her by a member of staff. Standard practice, the navigational choreography of these events, ensuring the family reached everyone on the list. James watched Charlotte approach Margaret, watched the brief introduction, watched Charlotte take Margaret's hand in the greeting, and then not release it. Not immediately, but hold it for just a moment longer than the standard handshake requires. He couldn't hear the conversation from where he stood, but he could read it. He had spent 17 years reading rooms, reading body language, reading the 1,000 tiny signals that people broadcast when they don't know they're broadcasting. What he read was this: Margaret, in the first moment, she had the posture of a person who has been told they are receiving an honor and is managing the self-consciousness of that. The small inward contraction. The gratitude laced with uncertainty about how to hold it. The particular awkwardness of people who spend their lives focused on others suddenly being the subject of focus themselves. And then something shifted. It shifted because Charlotte asked a question. James could see it in the shape of the exchange. The pause, and the slight tilt of Charlotte's head that meant she was waiting for an answer, not just for the answer to end. And Margaret, who had been managing her composure with the slight effortfulness of the self-conscious, began instead to talk. Really talk. Her posture changed. Her hands moved. She was describing something, explaining something, the way people explain things they know deeply and care about and rarely get invited to share. Charlotte listened. Not performed listening. Oh, not the polite nodding that says I am waiting for you to finish. The actual thing, leaning in slightly, responding to what was said before responding to the overall shape of the conversation. At one point, Margaret laughed. Not the social laugh of the public event, the startled, genuine laugh of someone who has been caught off guard by joy in a moment they didn't expect to contain it. Charlotte had said something that did that. James found himself trying to imagine what it was. The event ran longer than scheduled, as these events tend to when the conversations inside them turn real. James rotated positions at the hour mark, taking a post near the east entrance where a colleague handed him a brief summary of anything he'd missed, and then departed for a break. He stood at the new post and let the room settle back into his observation. The family was moving toward the final group of guests when the moment happened. Not a dramatic moment, not a public moment. Technically, it was tucked in a corner of the room at the edge of the gathering, a small scene unfolding without fanfare. An elderly man, different from the veteran in October, different circumstances entirely, had been standing alone for some time near the window. His name was on the guest list. He had been a school teacher for 40 years, the kind of teacher who changes lives one quiet conversation at a time. And he had been nominated by a former student who was now in his 40s and who had recently said publicly that this man's specific belief in him at age 14 had been the difference between a life that went well and one that might not have. He was standing alone because the event, however warmly organized, is still an event, and events are hard for people who are not comfortable in crowds, and he was clearly not comfortable in crowds. He was holding his tea with both hands. Yet he was watching the room with the careful eyes of a man who has always been more comfortable giving his attention than receiving it. Charlotte was moving past that corner with a member of staff when she stopped. James watched the staff member continue a half step before registering that Charlotte was no longer alongside them. She had stopped because she had noticed him. The staff member turned, said something quiet. Charlotte said something back, gesturing slightly toward the man at the window. The staff member's posture said, "We have more people to see." Charlotte's posture said yes, and also this. She crossed to the man at the window. He registered her approach with the slightly startled expression of someone who was not expecting to be sought out. He straightened. That social reflex of being found, being attended to, being included. Charlotte said something. He answered. She said something else, and this time he smiled. Slow. I'm warm. The smile of a man who spent 40 years investing in young people and is not entirely used to the investment returning. They talked for 4 minutes. James counted without meaning to. When Charlotte moved on, drawn back into the navigational flow of the event by a gentle word from her mother, the old teacher stood at his window for a long moment, his tea still in both hands, his face entirely different from the face he had been wearing before she arrived. And he looked like someone who had been found. James drove home that evening through a city gone dark and lit, the December streets carrying their specific mixture of cold and warmth, the shop windows bright against the early night. He thought about the school teacher, about Margaret in the blue coat, about a veteran in October and a boy with trains in a hospital ward. He thought about how it looks from the outside when someone has made a decision, not consciously, maybe not even articulately, but in the deep structural way that decisions actually get made about who they are going to be. He had watched public figures his entire career. He had watched people manage their image, manage their relationships with the public, manage the perception of warmth and accessibility with varying degrees of success. He did not judge this. He understood it, Public life requires navigation. Navigation requires awareness of how you are read. But what he had watched across these months was something outside that category. Charlotte was 9 years old and then 10. She was a child moving through the particular pressures and peculiarities of a life that most human beings will never come close to living. And somewhere inside all of that, the cameras and the protocol and the weight of lineage and the gaze of an entire watching world, she had found, or been given, or simply always possessed, and the clearest possible sense of what mattered. Not the image, not the occasion, not the history or the ceremony or the public record, the person in front of her, always the person in front of her. James parked his car. He sat for a moment before going inside, the engine cooling around him, the street quiet. He thought about his daughter's words. The people who actually help are never thinking about whether they should. He thought about courage. Not the version he had grown up learning, the cinematic version, the battlefield version, the version that arrives loud and announces itself. The other version, the quieter one, the one that doesn't look like courage at all from the outside. That just looks like a girl walking toward someone who needs her. He had spent 17 years guarding a palace. He had not expected, at this point in his career, to learn something new about strength. But there it was, just standing in a memorial garden in October, on a day that arrived like any other day. A 9-year-old girl had stepped forward before anyone else had gathered themselves to move. And something in James Whitfield, 17-year veteran, man who had seen a great many things, man who had thought he had cataloged most of the ways that a person can be brave, had been changed by it in a way he would carry forward for the rest of his life. Not because it was royal, because it was real. Because courage, when it is the genuine article, does not ask for permission, does not wait for instruction, does not calculate the odds, it just moves. And everything that happens after that is different because it did.